I still remember the shock of it. It was Christmas Eve, and a gentle snowfall dusted my front porch. My children, Lucas and Mina, were upstairs hanging decorations, while I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my overdue mortgage notice. My heart hammered with fear. I was short on cash for this month, mostly because I'd used the last of my savings to settle lingering debts related to Peter's funeral. It had only been 6 months since I lost him, and everything still felt raw and uncertain. Desperate, I picked up the phone and called my parents. "I'm in a bind," I confessed. "I need help with my mortgage payment, just this once." I held my breath, expecting at least a hint of sympathy. Instead, my father's voice was cold and businesslike. He said they had made plans to buy VIP tickets to Coachella for themselves and my younger sister, Denise. They didn't want to cancel such an exciting event. I could barely speak. My mother chimed in, telling me they had to prioritize their own happiness. Then came the final blow. My father, in a matter-of-fact tone, said, "Not our problem, Danica." My stomach lurched. He hung up. My world felt shattered. I sat there in silence for what felt like hours, replaying his words. Not our problem. Somehow it felt worse than anything I'd faced in the months since Peter's death. My hands trembled, and tears blurred my vision. Memories flooded back, times I had gone out of my way to support them, how I'd paid their monthly bills for so long. I was only 33, raising 2 children on my own, and my parents had turned their backs on me. The shock made my head throb. I thought about how I used to trust them and believe they'd always look out for me in a real crisis. But here I was, faced with the possibility of losing the house Peter and I had once shared. I slowly climbed the stairs to check on Lucas and Mina. They were excited about the Christmas lights, each hoping Santa would bring them something special. It crushed me to think about failing them. My tears tasted bitter, and I felt anger building. I had given up so much of my paycheck for years to help my parents, yet they didn't hesitate to dismiss my plea. That night, I lay awake, feeling betrayed, my heart pounding with dread. Growing up, I remember my mother and father as carefree people who loved indulging in expensive getaways. They retired early, each living off modest pensions, but their spending had always been reckless. I'd never questioned it before, because I was raised to believe in honoring and supporting my parents, especially when they got older. So, when their bills became tough for them to handle, I stepped in. For the past 3 years, I'd been quietly sending them about $2,500 a month. It wasn't easy for me and Peter, but I convinced him we had to show gratitude. My parents often bragged to their friends about how lucky they were, but I rarely heard them say thank you in private. Now, realizing they wouldn't even help me with a single payment made me furious. It wasn't like I was asking for a lavish gift. It was our home, the same place I'd shared with Peter, the place my kids considered a safe haven. I stared at old pictures on my phone, me hugging my parents at a barbecue, them smiling. If I'd known how selfish they could be, maybe I would have handled things differently. But at that moment, I only felt heartbreak and betrayal. I had to do something fast. The mortgage grace period was almost over, and Christmas was just a day away. I worried about the kids' gifts, the holiday dinner, and the painfully empty space at the table where Peter should have been. Stress knotted in my chest. That's when Jeremy called. He'd been one of Peter's closest friends, a practical yet empathetic person. He was the kind of friend you could count on in emergencies. We hadn't talked in a few months, but he must have sensed I was in trouble. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, but the moment I heard his warm greeting, my walls came down, and I found myself sobbing. I explained everything, how my parents refused to help, how I was short on the mortgage, how I felt so alone without Peter. Jeremy didn't hesitate. He assured me he'd help out with the payment, telling me to think of it as a favor to Peter's memory. I felt relief wash over me. It was like finally coming up for air after struggling underwater. I thanked him repeatedly, promising to pay him back as soon as I could. For the first time that night, I felt hope. With the immediate crisis handled, I had to think about the future. I couldn't go on relying on Jeremy or anyone else to bail me out. And I definitely couldn't count on my parents anymore. The anger at their betrayal still burned inside me, but I tried to channel it into something productive. I'd been a stay-at-home mom for years. Even though I graduated summa cum laude in marketing, My career had been on hold while Peter took care of our finances. Now, I realized it was time to stand on my own 2 feet. In the haze of stress, an idea sparked, an online store focusing on eco-friendly home essentials. It felt like a niche I was passionate about. Our world was changing, and people wanted sustainable options. Plus, I knew I had the marketing background to launch it successfully. I started researching, learning about suppliers and shipping options, using every free moment. After the kids went to sleep, early in the morning before they woke up, I drew out plans in a well-worn notebook. My grief still lingered, but planning this business lit a small fire in me. It gave me a sense of purpose, beyond just surviving. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster. News that I had magically fixed my mortgage problem without their help must have reached my parents. They called me out of the blue, sounding oddly chipper at first, as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't the same daughter who would eagerly pick up the phone and chat about their next vacation plans. I told them I was fine and that I was busy focusing on my children and my new business idea. Then my mother's voice turned sharp, accusing me of being distant. My father grumbled about how I hadn't sent them their usual monthly support. The nerve of it all stunned me. "After everything I've done, you can't even help me one time," I replied, voice trembling. My father's response was dismissive. He claimed I was being dramatic. My mother said she hoped I'd get over my anger so we could go back to normal. Normal for them meant me footing their bills while they played around with their expensive hobbies. That call solidified my decision. I told them I wouldn't be sending money anymore and hung up. My hands shook, but my spirit felt oddly free. Daring to cut off my parents financially after years of routine payments felt like leaping off a cliff without a parachute. I knew they'd be furious, but I also felt a rare sense of empowerment. I realized I was finally standing up for myself. Still, guilt weighed on my shoulders. I worried about their well-being. What if they were really in trouble and I'd abandoned them? But then I remembered how easily they dismissed my crisis. They weren't concerned about losing their home. They were more worried about missing a music festival. A couple of days after that tense phone call, my mother sent me a text. "We need to talk about the money situation." I ignored it. Then another message, "You can't do this, we're your parents." My blood boiled. The hypocrisy was astounding. I decided to block their numbers for a little while, just to get some peace during the holidays. The kids needed my full attention. I wanted to focus on moving forward, not sinking further into the toxic cycle. Cutting them off felt risky, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was prioritizing my own household's future. Denise, my younger sister, was usually the golden child in the family. She and I had never been especially close, primarily because my parents always held her up as the star. She traveled the world, had a glamorous job in event planning, and partied in places I'd only ever heard about on TV. But when I finally got around to checking my emails, I found a long message from Denise. She wrote that our parents were venting about how I refused to help them anymore, and how I'd gone off the rails. She was shocked, unsure what was going on. The email felt genuine, not accusatory. She admitted she had no idea I'd been supporting them financially, or that I'd even needed help with my mortgage. I took a deep breath and replied, outlining the entire situation from my perspective. I told her about Dad's cruel dismissal, about how much I'd paid in their bills, and about Peter's funeral expenses. I made it clear that I wasn't trying to burden her, but I needed her to know the truth. I sent the email and waited, heart pounding. Part of me wondered if she'd take their side, but a small part of me hoped she'd understand. Within a day, I got Denise's reply. She sounded angry, not at me, but at our parents. She said she felt blindsided, especially about the mortgage crisis and the funeral costs. She'd thought Mom and Dad were funding their own lifestyle, not leaning on me. And to discover that they refused to help me when I needed just one bit of support, it disgusted her. She wanted to meet in person as soon as she got back from her latest work trip. Reading her email, I felt relief and a touch of validation. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe, despite our differences, Denise and I could find some common ground. However, my parents soon tried a new tactic. They sent a manipulative group email to our extended relatives, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who suddenly cut them off for no reason. Some distant cousins forwarded it to me, alarmed by the harsh tone. In that email, my parents downplayed my mortgage trouble, implying I was overreacting. But the extended family had questions. Apparently, they'd seen glimpses of the tension at past gatherings. With Denise's support, I wrote back, calmly detailing facts and figures. For once, the truth was on my side, and it felt powerful. As the holiday season wound down, I found myself pouring every spare minute into my e-commerce business plan. I named the store Green Haven Essentials, focusing on eco-friendly cleaning supplies, reusable kitchen items, and biodegradable packaging. At first, it was just a plan on paper, but each day it grew more real. Starting a business brought new challenges: finding reliable suppliers, building a website, creating marketing strategies. Although I had a marketing degree, the practical side tested me. But it was exhilarating. I felt Peter's spirit close by, almost like he was cheering me on from somewhere I couldn't see. Meanwhile, my parents escalated their outrage. They left voicemails accusing me of being heartless. They said I was spiting them for no reason. Part of me wanted to scream back that this was their doing, not mine. But instead, I funneled that hurt into my work. Orders began trickling in, slowly at first, then more steadily. On nights when I stayed up late printing shipping labels or replying to customer inquiries, I felt energized. This was something I was building myself, for my children and me. For once, I wasn't just surviving. I was creating a new life, piece by piece. Word about my venture spread through social media. Friends and neighbors started sharing my store's link. I ran a few targeted ads online, and before I knew it, my tiny Green Haven Essentials operation began to blossom. The first time I saw 100 orders come in within a single day, I nearly cried with relief. It felt surreal. Meanwhile, my parents were facing a different reality. According to Denise, who spoke to them occasionally, they were struggling financially. Without my monthly contributions, they couldn't keep up with mortgage payments on their large house. They'd also fallen behind on the boat loan they'd picked up years ago. When Denise tried to advise them to downsize, they became defensive and blamed me. They claimed I owed them for raising me. Denise stood her ground, reminding them they were adults who made their own financial decisions. Hearing how stubborn they were made me sad, not triumphant. Despite everything, they were still my parents, and the thought of them losing their home while I was finally stabilizing mine felt twisted. But I also knew this was a consequence of their overspending and neglect of real responsibilities. With each passing week, I found myself wrapped up in the momentum of my growing business. My daily routines were a blur of preparing breakfasts for Lucas and Mina, driving them to school, rushing back home to pack orders, and spending evenings doing market research. I had never juggled so many tasks, but the sense of purpose fueled me. Financially, we were finally in the black. My mortgage was current, and I was even setting aside savings. The future felt brighter than it had in a very long time. Jeremy continued to check in on me, offering tips on budgeting and business expansion. His friendship was priceless. Then one evening, Denise dropped by unannounced. She looked both concerned and excited. She told me our parents' home had officially entered foreclosure. They were forced to sell their boat and put their timeshare on the market. The news churned my stomach. A pang of guilt twisted inside me. I remembered all the times I'd wired them money, thinking I was helping them stay afloat. But I had actually enabled their reckless spending. Now, they were dealing with the harsh consequences. I wished it could have ended differently, but I also knew I had to protect my own kids' future. After hearing about my parents' predicament, I braced myself for the fallout. Sure enough, they reached out again, leaving messages that sounded more desperate than angry. They kept saying they needed a bridge to get through the crisis. I paused before even considering a response. A part of me wanted to rush to their rescue. That daughterly instinct was hard to ignore. But the memory of my father's dismissive, "not our problem," replayed in my mind. I refused to let guilt trap me again. They had shown no concern for my children and me when we were on the brink of losing our home. Despite the swirl of emotions, I needed to stay focused. My support system had grown beyond Jeremy. I joined a widowed parents group where we shared stories of heartbreak, single parenting, and finances. Hearing similar experiences strengthened my resolve to protect my family from toxic patterns. When I turned off my phone that night, I felt a sense of calm. I'd done what I needed to do. It wasn't my responsibility to save my parents from a crisis they had largely brought upon themselves. I was done being their safety net. A few months later, life began to feel almost normal again. With the business thriving, I took a safe leap and moved us into a more family-friendly neighborhood. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a cozy place where Lucas and Mina could ride bikes on the sidewalk and make friends. Packing our old home felt bittersweet. I found reminders of Peter everywhere. His favorite coffee mug, the baseball cap he'd worn every weekend. At times I broke down, missing his steady presence and gentle humor. But moving felt like the next logical step. A fresh page for the kids and me. We settled in quickly. The neighbors were welcoming, offering plates of homemade cookies or friendly waves. Lucas and Mina seemed happier, riding their scooters in the cul-de-sac, laughing with other kids. For me, the new environment lightened the emotional load. I felt more hopeful about the future. I still kept my parents at arm's length. Every so often, I'd get an update from Denise. She told me they finally lost their house, had to rent a small apartment, and were still bitter about my betrayal. I sighed, wondering if they'd ever see the part they played in all this. Though I moved away from my parents, Denise and I started growing closer. She was outraged by how our parents treated me, but confessed she was relieved to learn the truth. She also felt used. Our parents had always praised her for being successful, but they never asked her for money. Instead, they let me shoulder that burden, while Denise remained ignorant of the situation. One day, she visited my new place, bringing thoughtful housewarming gifts, bamboo towels, and glass storage containers to match my eco-friendly theme. Over tea, I told her more about Peter and how much I missed him. She listened with genuine compassion. When the conversation shifted to our parents, Denise sighed. They were calling her frequently, hoping she'd intervene and convince me to start sending them money again. But Denise refused, telling them to work on their finances. She even offered to help them find part-time jobs or a financial advisor. They declined, insisting the problem was me, not them. By the time Denise left that afternoon, I felt lighter. We hugged, realizing that for the first time in our lives, we were truly connecting. It felt like a silver lining in this messy family situation. As the weeks rolled on, I focused on nurturing the positive aspects of my life. My children were doing well in school, I was expanding my product line to include more green alternatives, and sales continued to climb. Still, a tiny part of me wondered about my parents' well-being. I tried not to dwell on it, reminding myself they were adults who had chosen their path. Yet, despite my resolve, I sometimes felt haunted by the memories of the good times we had before money became a divider. Late one night, I received an unexpected email from my mother. She wrote in a tone I didn't recognize, gentle, remorseful, and pleading. She said they'd lost everything, their big house, the boat, the timeshare, and now they were scraping by in a small apartment. Dad was in a deep depression, spending most of his days staring at the wall. She asked if I would meet them, just to talk things out. I read the words several times, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure if I wanted to open those wounds, but part of me missed having parents. Part of me was tired of the anger that had been my constant companion for so long. I agreed to meet them in a neutral place, a small cafe near their new apartment. I arrived early, nerves jangling. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would they blame me again? Beg for more money? Would they even acknowledge their mistakes? They walked in together, looking older and more frail than I remembered. My father's once confident stride was replaced by slow, tentative steps. My mother's eyes looked puffy, like she'd been crying. I sat up straight, bracing myself. When they reached my table, my father's voice cracked as he said, "I'm so sorry, Danica." I blinked, unsure I heard right. He actually admitted they'd been selfish. He said they took me for granted, that he never thought about how his words, "not our problem," could cut me so deep. My mother squeezed my hand, tears rolling down her cheeks. It was surreal. For so long, I'd dreamed of this apology. Now here it was, but I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a swirl of sadness and relief, like I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for miles and someone finally offered to share the load. My father, a man I'd never seen shed a tear, actually cried. He said he regretted everything, from his harsh dismissal to his life of extravagance that he had allowed me to fund. My mother chimed in, admitting she was too proud to see the danger they were headed toward. They spoke about therapy sessions they'd started. They mentioned how the counselor urged them to take responsibility for their actions. I listened quietly, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to hug them, to console them and say it was all okay. But another part of me remembered the humiliation and fear when I thought I'd lose my house. I felt torn, caught between love and anger. They begged for a second chance, especially to reconnect with Lucas and Mina. They said they understood if I couldn't forgive them right away, but they wanted me to know they were truly sorry. Leaving the cafe that day, I felt more conflicted than ever. I believed they were being genuine, yet the scars ran deep. I needed to protect myself and my children first. Forgiveness, if it came, would be on my terms. I refused to rush into anything. The next few days, I tried to digest that emotional encounter. My parents were going to therapy. They wanted to rebuild our relationship. It felt almost too good to be true. Yet recalling my father's tears made it hard to dismiss. For once, he didn't seem arrogant or dismissive. He looked like a broken man who finally recognized he'd done something terribly wrong. In the meantime, I talked to Denise, recounting every detail. She was shocked that Dad had cried. We both admitted we didn't know what to do next. Could we really trust them to change? Or was this just another ploy to get me to reopen my bank account for them? I remembered the counselor they mentioned. That detail gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe this time they were genuinely trying to fix themselves. I also thought about Peter, wishing he were here to give me advice or hold my hand. I could almost imagine him telling me to be cautious but kind. Eventually, I decided to set boundaries. If my parents were serious about change, they'd respect those boundaries. I still needed time to protect my heart, and more importantly, protect Lucas and Mina from further disappointment. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter. Yes, a real letter in an envelope from my mother. She wrote about their continued therapy sessions, how they'd started volunteering at a local charity shop to find renewed purpose. She sounded sincere, sharing small steps they were taking to manage their finances. Dad had even found a part-time job at a grocery store, stocking shelves in the early morning hours. The letter ended with a gentle plea. They hoped to see Lucas and Mina, even if just for an afternoon. They wanted a chance to form a relationship with their grandchildren, separate from the money drama. Reading this, I felt my heart soften a bit. I decided to let the children see them, but only in a controlled environment. My home, with me present at all times. I didn't share the details of the past year with Lucas and Mina. They were too young to understand the complexity, and I didn't want them bearing grudges. Instead, I told them Grandma and Grandpa wanted to visit and that we should show them kindness while being cautious. I wondered if I was doing the right thing. My mind told me to stay guarded, but my heart reminded me of the healing power of second chances. When my parents arrived at our new home, they were noticeably nervous. My father clutched a small bouquet of flowers, and my mother had a bag of homemade cookies. Lucas and Mina approached hesitantly, but once Grandpa offered them the cookies, they warmed up. It was a quiet, tentative visit. I watched my parents interact with my children, noticing an unfamiliar gentleness in their eyes. My father looked genuinely delighted when Lucas showed him his new action figures. My mother listened attentively as Mina explained her artwork. The tension in my chest eased, but caution lingered. After about an hour, we all sat around the living room, sipping lemonade. Nobody mentioned money or the past arguments. Instead, we talked about the children's school, my e-commerce business, and the volunteer work my parents were doing. It was civil, even pleasant. When they left, they thanked me with tearful hugs. I could feel their relief. As for me, I felt a complicated mix, partly hopeful, partly apprehensive. I'd opened a small window for them to come back into my life, but the walls I built wouldn't fall overnight. Boundaries were still there, and I intended to keep them until trust was fully earned. Over the following months, my parents continued their therapy, occasionally sending me updates to show how committed they were. They never once asked for money, which was a huge relief. If anything, they seemed embarrassed by how they used to rely on my support. I was careful not to give them false hope. The wounds were still fresh, and I wasn't ready for a complete family reunion. We kept our visits short and mostly focused on the kids. Each time, my parents would bring small, thoughtful gifts. A coloring book for Mina, a puzzle for Lucas. I appreciated the effort, but I also remained guarded. Meanwhile, Green Haven Essentials was booming. I'd expanded the product line to include reusable grocery bags, eco-friendly baby products, and even compostable party supplies. Media outlets started taking notice, and I was invited for a local radio interview about sustainable living. My days were busier than ever, but in the best way. During a routine check-in, Jeremy asked how I felt about my parents' apparent transformation. I admitted that I was still sorting through my emotions. He said something that struck me. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means you're choosing to move forward, whatever that looks like for you. I kept his words close to my heart. As life settled into a new rhythm, I decided it was time to talk openly with my parents about the hurt they caused. We arranged to meet again at the cafe. This time, I had a list of points I needed to address. Sitting down, I started with how abandoned I felt when they dismissed my plea for help. My father lowered his gaze, nodding slowly. He admitted he'd been caught up in his own pleasure-seeking, never imagining he could truly lose everything. My mother added that she felt I was always the strong one, so she assumed I'd manage somehow. Her words stung, but I appreciated the honesty. I explained that even if I forgave them, I could never wipe away the memory of that day. The sinking feeling that my own parents saw my crisis as not their problem. They listened, tears in their eyes, and promised they would spend the rest of their lives making it up to me and my kids. As the conversation wound down, I felt something lift. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but it was a step toward letting go of my resentment. I realized I wanted to move forward, not stay locked in bitterness forever. Time can be a strange healer. Over the next year, I witnessed small but meaningful changes in my parents. They continued therapy, downsized their living situation without complaint, and never once asked me for financial support. Instead, they found ways to rebuild their own stability. My father worked diligently at the grocery store, and my mother picked up a job tutoring children in Spanish, her second language. I also had a heart-to-heart with Denise, reflecting on how our family had shifted so drastically. We laughed bitterly about the irony that losing everything forced our parents to appreciate us in a more genuine way. She confessed she felt closer to me than ever, seeing how I'd overcome so many hardships. Our sisterly bond grew in ways I never thought possible. On the home front, Lucas and Mina seemed genuinely happy to have grandparents who showed interest in them, rather than just flaunting their possessions. Each visit felt less tense, more natural. I carefully guarded my heart, but I noticed it softening toward my parents as they kept showing up and taking responsibility. Looking at the bigger picture, I could finally see a future where all of us, though changed by pain, could still find a new kind of family harmony. I sometimes replay that fateful Christmas Eve in my mind, remembering how betrayed I felt. But then I look at my life now, my thriving business, my happy children, my closer bond with Denise, and even my parents' slow but earnest path to redemption. It's not the fairy tale ending I once imagined, but it's real, and in many ways, it's more genuine. Standing in my living room, I see photos on the mantle. Peter's warm smile, Lucas and Mina grinning on a family trip, my parents holding the kids at a recent picnic. My father looks older, my mother wears simple clothing instead of flashy designer outfits. Yet there's a peacefulness in their eyes. It symbolizes the transformations we've all undergone. If I were to advise someone going through a similar hardship, I'd say forgiveness is a winding road. It's not about pretending the hurt never happened. It's about deciding you won't let it define you anymore. For me, letting go of anger allowed more space for love, ambition, and joy. I still miss Peter every day, but I feel him guiding me, encouraging me to keep growing and nurturing the good in my life. And so I continue, day by day, committed to healing, raising my kids, and living on my own terms.